But immediately following the passage of the Constitution, a pretty fundamental conflict came up. What kind of country should we be? The one vision of America was put forward by Alexander Hamilton, who'd served in the war as Washington's top aide and would go on to be his first Secretary of the Treasury, and probably would have been president himself had he not been born in the British West Indies. Hamilton had a strong personality, and as you can see, the beautiful wavy hair of a Caribbean god, and he had very definite ideas about what he wanted the future of America to look like. First, Hamilton wanted the country to be mercantile, which means that he believed that we should be deeply involved in world trade. Second, he wanted the US to be a manufacturing powerhouse. We wouldn't just buy and sell stuff, we would make it too. He even invested in a plan to make Paterson, New Jersey a manufacturing hub, which of course ultimately failed because New Jersey. But to make a manufacturing giant, he needed a strong government that could build infrastructure and protect patents, but you already knew that he was in favor of a strong government because of course he wrote so many of the Federalist Papers. Jefferson wanted an America that was predominantly agrarian, with most people being small-scale, subsistence-level farmers. Maybe they would produce a little surplus for local markets, but certainly not for international consumers. There would be no international trade. And he didn't want manufacturing either. This small-scale local economy could best be served by a small-scale local government. It's not a surprise to find that Jefferson's sympathies lay with the anti-federalists, even though he benefited from the new Constitution a little bit since, you know, he eventually got to be president and everything. Unlike the elitist Hamilton, Jefferson was an avowed Democrat, which meant that he distrusted concentrated power and privilege and believed that the masses could basically govern themselves. To him, government and concentrated economic power were greater threats to liberty than a tyrannical majority. Jefferson was a big fan of the French, and not only because he spent a fair amount of time in Paris as our ambassador there, he also liked the French because they fought with us in the War of Independence against the British, and because after 1789 he liked the way the French treated their aristocrats, that is, brutally. In general, Jefferson and his partisans, who called themselves Republicans, although some current textbooks call them Democratic Republicans just to make things incredibly confusing, preferred France just as the Hamiltonians preferred Britain. And this was a bit of a problem because France and England were pretty much constantly at war between 1740 and 1850. Okay, so in the first real American presidential election, there weren't any political parties. There wasn't even a campaign. The election was uncontested and George Washington won. He didn't even have to run for office. He stood for it. Washington's presidency is important for a number of precedents that he set, including the notion that a president should only serve 2 terms and the idea that even if he was a general, the president should wear civilian clothing, but he wasn't the real policy brains. Hamilton was. Washington probably wouldn't have called himself a Federalist, but he backed Hamilton's plan for a stronger nation. And to that end, Hamilton began the great American tradition of having a 5-point plan. Point 1, establish the nation's credit worthiness. Hamilton realized that if the new nation wanted to be taken seriously, it had to pay off its debts, most of which had come during the war. And to do this, Hamilton proposed that the US government assume the debts that the states had amassed. Point 2, create a national debt. That's something you don't hear politicians say these days. Hamilton wanted to create new interest-bearing bonds, hoping to give the rich people a stake in our nation's success. Point 3, create a Bank of the United States. This bank would be private and it would turn a profit for its shareholders, but it would hold public funds and issue notes that would circulate as currency, and the bank would definitely be needed to house all the money that was expected to be raised from point 4, a whiskey tax. Then, as now, Americans like to drink, and one sure way to raise money was to set an excise tax on whiskey, which might reduce drinking on the margins or cause people to switch to beer, but what it would definitely do is hurt small farmers who found the most profitable use of their grain was to distill it into sweet, sweet whiskey. So the whiskey tax really upset small farmers, as we will see in a moment. Point 5, encourage domestic industrial manufacturing by imposing a tariff. For those of you who think the US was founded on free trade principles, think again. Now, you'll remember that the Republicans wanted an agrarian republic with freer trade, so they disliked pretty much all of Hamilton's plan. They also argued that none of this was in the Constitution, and they were right. This position of expecting government to be limited by the text of the Constitution came to be known as strict construction. But the Republicans lacked a 5-point plan of their own, so their only hope of success was to shave Hamilton's 5-point plan down to 4 points, which is what they did. In 1790, Republicans, many of whom were Southerners like Jefferson, struck a bargain. They agreed to points 1 through 4 of Hamilton's plan in exchange for a permanent capital on the Potomac in the South, as opposed to the first 2 temporary capitals of the US in New York and Philadelphia. So the Hamiltonian economy won out. for a while. And the French Revolution made things even more complicated because Republicans liked it, but Federalists, being somewhat conservative and elitist, were afraid of it. This was especially true when French emissary Citizen Genet showed up in 1793 and started hiring American ships to attack British ones. Britain, in response, began impressing American sailors. Washington dispatched Secretary of State John Jay to deal with the impressment issue, and he negotiated the boringly named Jay Treaty, which improved trade relations between the U.S. and Britain and said absolutely nothing about impressment or American shipping rights. Because the vice presidency went to whomever had the second highest total number of electoral votes, and that person happened to be Thomas Jefferson, we ended up in a situation where the president and the vice president were on opposite sides of the political spectrum. Especially the way Adams' administration totally overreacted to problems with France. Because we were trying to maintain good commercial relationships with England, and England was perpetually at war with France, France ended up in a quasi-war with the United States despite our eternal alliance. They disrupted our shipping, we felt nervous about their increasingly violent revolution, and then, after 3 French emissaries tried to extort a bribe from the US government as part of negotiations, the so-called XYZ affair, because we didn't want to give the names of these bribe-seeking French scoundrels, the American public turned against France somewhat hysterically, as it will. Taking advantage of the hysteria, Adams pushed through the Alien and Sedition Act. The Alien Act lengthened the period of time it took to become a citizen, and the Sedition Act made it a crime to criticize the government. The Alien and Sedition Acts were allowed to lapse under Jefferson, and they didn't lead to widespread arrests of everyone who called Adams a tyrant or expressed admiration for the French Revolution, and even though they weren't popular, they didn't doom the Federalist Party either, even though no Federalist was elected president after Adams.